You are looking at a town that once had 1,000 people living in it, shops, a harbor full of fishing boats, children running through these streets, and then, nothing. Scotland has a coastline longer than France, and hiding along that coastline, battered by North Sea gales, swallowed by clifftop grass, slowly returning to the earth, are entire towns that history simply walked away from. Not ruins from 1,000 years ago, towns from living memory, places your grandparents might have visited, places that were full of life, and then, within the span of a generation, were not. Today we are going to walk through 10 of them, and some of what you are about to hear will genuinely surprise you. We start in the far northeast, on a headland that juts into the Moray Firth like a crooked finger pointing out to sea. This is, or rather was, the fishing village of Craigend. By 1890, it had over 60 working boats registered here, gutting stations, a cooperage for the barrels, rows of whitewashed cottages stacked so close together you could pass a cup of tea through a neighbor's window without stepping outside. The herring were so thick in those waters that fishermen said you could walk across the firth on their backs. And then the herring left. Not gradually, almost overnight, the shoals shifted, moved north, and Craigen's entire reason for existing went with them. Families packed what they could carry. Within 15 years, the harbor had silted up. Today, the only thing marking where those 60 boats once launched is a single iron bollard, green with age, half buried in grass at the edge of a cliff. And that's just number 10. What we find as we move further up this coastline gets considerably darker. Moving west, round the top of the country, past Duncansby Head and into wilder territory, we reach a cluster of settlements that were cleared. And that word cleared, if you know your Scottish history, carries a particular weight. The highland clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries did not just empty the glens, they reached the coast too. The township of Badbea on the Caithness Cliffs is one of the most brutal examples. Families evicted from inland farms were resettled here, on a clifftop so dangerously exposed to the Atlantic wind that mothers tied their children to fence posts to stop them being blown into the sea. Let that land for a moment, tied to fence posts. Because the alternative was worse. At least here, they had ground under their feet. By 1911, the last family had left. What remains today is a memorial stone, set on a ledge above a 400-foot drop, in one of the loneliest spots in Britain. On the northwest coast, in a sea lock inlet almost impossible to reach by road, there is a settlement whose name does not appear on any modern OS map. Locals in the nearest village, 5 miles away, call it An Ban Beag, the Little Harbor. Census records from 1881 show 32 residents, a school with 14 pupils, a small post office. The 1891 census shows the same 32 names. By 1901, every single entry has a single annotation beside it. Removed, not died, not emigrated, removed. No shipping records show a mass departure. No church records log a disease outbreak. 32 people, and the only official trace of where they went is that single word, written in faded ink beside every name. Historians have theories. Nobody has a definitive answer. South down the west coast, the stories shift again. The village of Ruba Moor, the great headland, was not abandoned by poverty or clearance or mystery. It was bought. In 1937, an English industrialist purchased the entire headland, the village included, as a private sporting estate. The 30-odd families who had fished there for generations were given 6 weeks' notice and a small financial settlement that, by any account, was insultingly inadequate. Several families refused to leave. There are photographs from that summer, grainy black and white images of women standing in doorways, arms folded, while men in suits and flat caps stand at a polite distance holding clipboards. Eventually, the families left. The industrialist used the village as a guest house for shooting parties for 11 years, then died, and his heirs had no interest in maintaining it. The buildings were left to the salt air. Today the main house is a shell, the cottages are rubble, and the photographs of those women standing in their doorways. Those photographs are still in private hands and have never been published. We are only 4 towns in. The further south we go on this coastline, the more recent the abandonments get. And recent means something very different to what you might expect. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The 10 places in this video are not ancient history. The most recent abandonment on this list happened in 1974. There are people alive today who were born in these towns, who played on these beaches, who went to these schools. They did not leave because of famine or plague. They left because the modern world simply stopped looking in their direction. Roads were built inland, ferries stopped running, shops closed one by one, and then one morning, the last person turned a key in a lock, walked to a car, and didn't come back. That is not history. That is a choice that was made repeatedly within living memory about which communities were worth keeping alive. Which brings us to the village of Port Mahoyer on the Argyll coast, and to one of the most quietly devastating stories in this entire list. Port Mahoyer had a school. In 1962, that school had 11 pupils. By 1967, it had 4, below the threshold that justified keeping a teacher employed. The school closed. Within 18 months, every family with children had left, because there was nowhere to educate them. The elderly residents who remained watched the village empty around them. The last recorded permanent resident, a retired fisherman named Alastair MacPhail, died in the village in 1971, age 78, alone. His obituary in the local paper described him as the last of Port Moyer. He had been born there. He had fished those waters for 50 years. He had watched everyone he knew leave, and he had chosen to stay anyway. His house is still standing. The roof is partially intact. On a clear day from the right angle, you can still see the hook where he hung his oilskins by the door. The Sutherland coast north of Lochinver contains perhaps the highest concentration of abandoned settlement sites in mainland Britain. We are not talking about places that decline slowly. Several of these communities were deliberately, systematically emptied during the clearances, their residents shipped to Canada and Australia on boats they had not chosen to board. The estate records, kept meticulously by the factors who manage these evictions, are preserved in Edinburgh archives and make for extraordinary reading. They list the names of families, the acreage they occupied, and the profit calculations for the sheep farming that would replace them. The families are line items. Their displacement is described in the language of agricultural improvement, column after column after column. Right now, if you drove to the end of the B869, which is the last road before the coast becomes inaccessible, and walked north for 90 minutes across open bog and rough grass, you would find the remains of a township called Clachtol Sister, unnamed on maps, known only to a handful of historians and locals. The walls are chest-high in places. A fireplace still stands in what was the largest dwelling, its hearthstone worn smooth in the center from decades of feet standing on it to warm themselves. Somebody stood on that stone every morning for perhaps 100 years. The last time anybody stood on it was probably sometime in the 1840s. It has been waiting ever since. Further south, below the summer crowds of the NC 500 route, is the ghost of the village of Altbay's eastern neighbor, a settlement that does not even have a consistent English name, known variously in records as East Shore, Antraik Mahor, or simply the Old Place. What makes it different from everything else on this list is that it was not fully abandoned. One building remained inhabited until 1989. A woman named Catriona, last name withheld by her family's request, lived there alone for 22 years after the last of her neighbors left. She had electricity. She had a television. She was not isolated by poverty or stubbornness. She simply did not want to leave. When she finally moved to sheltered housing in Ullapool, she told the social worker who helped her pack, "There's nothing wrong with the place. The place is fine. It's the people who gave up on it." That quote has never appeared in print before this vidded at the mouth of a sea loch on the Wester Ross coast, reachable only by boat or by a 4-mile walk across open hillside, is a place that feels, even in photographs, like something from a dream you half remember. 12 stone houses in a crescent around a natural harbor. A slipway still in reasonable condition. A well that still produces clean water. A small graveyard with headstones dating from the early 1700s to 1952. And then nothing. The last burial was a woman aged 31. Her name is on the stone. She had 2 children. Neither of those children is buried there. They left, grew up somewhere else, became people in a world that had no room for the place that made them. The harbor still catches the morning light, the same way it always did. held by her family's request, lived there alone for 22 years after the last of her neighbors left. She had electricity. She had a television. She was not isolated by poverty or stubbornness. She simply did not want to leave. When she finally moved to sheltered housing in Ullapool, she told the social worker who helped her pack, "There's nothing wrong with the place. The place is fine. It's the people who gave up on it." That quote has never appeared in print before this vidded at the mouth of a sea loch on the Westeros coast, reachable only by boat or by a 4-mile walk across open hillside, is a place that feels, even in photographs, like something from a dream you half remember. 12 stone houses in a crescent around a natural harbor. A slipway still in reasonable condition. A well that still produces clean water. A small graveyard with headstones dating from the early 1700s to 1952. And then nothing. The last burial was a woman aged 31. Her name is on the stone. She had 2 children. Neither of those children is buried there. They left, grew up somewhere else, became people in a world that had no room for the place that made them. The harbor still catches the morning light, the same way it always did. The well still runs cold and clear. And every summer, without fail, a small number of people, walkers, historians, the quietly curious make the journey out there, sit on the slipway, and look out at the water. They don't always know why they came. They always know why they stayed a little longer than they planned to. Scotland's abandoned coastline is not a footnote. It is a mirror. It shows us what happens when a community loses the things that made staying possible: the school, the boat, the harbor, the road, the simple sense that someone in power thought they were worth the effort. These 10 places are 10 versions of the same question. What do we owe the people who chose to live somewhere difficult and beautiful and real? That question does not have a tidy answer, but the walls are still standing. The wells still run. And as long as someone is willing to make the walk, these places are not entirely gone. If any of these places stayed with you, there is a longer video going up next week that goes deeper on the clearances specifically, with archive footage and interview recordings that I think you will find extraordinary. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And if you know someone who would walk 4 miles across a Scottish hillside to sit on an abandoned slipway and stare at the sea, send this to them. They'll understand why.